Late 1942, Berlin. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, an intelligence report lands on an engineer's desk. It describes a new American factory, codenamed Willow Run, with a production target that reads like a statistical fantasy. The claim? One B-24 heavy bomber will roll off its assembly line every 60 minutes. To the German experts, whose own advanced factories struggled to build one such bomber a day, the number was beyond belief. It was a crude, arrogant American bluff. The report was stamped propaganda and filed away, its terrifying implications dismissed as impossible. But this was not a simple miscalculation. It was the final step in a chain of disbelief that stretched across the Atlantic. This is the story of how one of the most vital pieces of industrial intelligence of the war was gathered in plain sight, passed through a network of spies and diplomats, and presented to the German High Command. At every step, the report was checked, and at every step, the facts were rejected. This wasn't a failure of espionage, it was a failure of imagination. It forces a fundamental question. How can a nation's own ideology and industrial limits make the truth about its enemy seem like an impossible lie? To understand this failure, we must first step inside the mind of the German war machine in 1942. Its power was undeniable, but it was built on a very specific foundation, a culture of master craftsmanship. German factories, like the sprawling Messerschmitt works at Regensburg or the Junkers plant in Dessau, were cathedrals of precision engineering. They were run by a generation of Meister, master technicians, who guided teams of highly skilled workers. Their philosophy was to build complex, technologically superior weapons with painstaking care. A Junkers Ju-88 bomber wasn't just assembled, it was crafted. This process was their strength. It gave them some of the most advanced aircraft in the world, but it was also their frame of reference, their absolute benchmark for what was industrially possible. A heavy bomber was a monumental undertaking, the work of days and weeks, not hours. This was their reality. Layered over this industrial reality was a thick, distorting lens of ideology. The Nazi regime's view of the United States was not just dismissive, it was a core tenet of their propaganda. America was officially portrayed as a decadent, racially polluted society of consumers. A nation of shopkeepers, as the old insult went, too obsessed with individual comfort, jazz music, and Hollywood films to organize for total war. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels assured the German people that American society, a chaotic melting pot, lacked the unity, discipline, and iron will of the Reich. Here, these two powerful forces, practical experience and ideological prejudice, collided to create a profound cognitive bias. For a German production planner, the idea of a factory churning out a complex four-engine bomber every hour wasn't just an exaggeration, it contradicted his entire professional life. For a high-ranking Nazi official, the same idea was equally absurd. It suggested a level of focused, centralized power that, according to their own doctrine, a democracy like America simply could not possess. Any intelligence suggesting otherwise was therefore fighting an uphill battle against the very structure of German thought. It wasn't just questioned on its merits, it was perceived as an attack on their own proven excellence and a contradiction of their fundamental worldview. This was the filter, part industrial fact, part ideological fantasy, through which all information from across the Atlantic would be judged. The information that challenged this worldview did not arrive via a clandestine agent with a hidden camera. It was gathered, piece by painstaking piece, by Germany's military intelligence service, the Abwehr, under the command of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Before America entered the war, his diplomats and agents in the United States, and later in neutral hubs like Lisbon and Bern, were tasked with a mundane but crucial mission: to read American magazines. Publications like Life, Fortune, and Aviation Week weren't just reporting on Henry Ford's audacious plan for Willow Run, they were celebrating it. They openly published detailed floor plans, artists' renderings of the massive factory, and interviews with Ford himself. The very production targets that seemed so fantastical in Berlin were printed for millions of Americans to see. This open-source data was then cross-referenced with the formal reports of German military attachés and the informal chatter overheard in Washington's diplomatic circles. The result was not a single, questionable dispatch from a lone spy. It was a mosaic of information from dozens of different sources, all telling the exact same unbelievable story. For the analysts compiling the reports, this perfect consistency was, itself, suspicious. It didn't look like a collection of facts. It looked like a coordinated, brilliantly executed propaganda campaign. The Abwehr compiled this mountain of public data and private reports into a single, coherent assessment. Now, this file began its journey into the heart of the German war machine. The Abwehr file, thick with newspaper clippings, blueprints, and diplomatic cables, now arrived at its first critical destination, the intelligence analysis branch of the Luftwaffe, the Fremde Luftwaffen. These were not ideologues. They were Germany's foremost aviation experts. Their job was to dissect enemy capabilities with cold, technical precision. The Willow Run report was placed on a desk, and the analysts began to do what they did best: run the numbers. They laid the American specifications: a single, mile-long assembly line, a workforce of over 40,000, a finished bomber every hour, against their own gold standard of aircraft production. They calculated the logistics. A single B-24 Liberator required thousands of individual components and over 300,000 rivets. To produce one per hour meant a constant, uninterrupted flow of engines from one supplier, fuselages from another, landing gear from a third. It demanded a river of raw materials: aluminum, steel, rubber, that would need to be processed and delivered on a schedule that seemed physically impossible. Based on the German model, where skilled teams built aircraft in dedicated bays over days, the math simply broke down. The scale was wrong. The resource requirements were astronomical. The entire concept violated the fundamental principles of complex manufacturing as they knew them. Their conclusion was professional, dispassionate, and absolute. The report was a fantasy, a work of fiction. It was stamped with the bureaucratic equivalent of unreliable, and a note was added, likely a piece of American propaganda, deliberately designed to intimidate the Reich. The file, now officially flagged as dubious, continued its journey up the chain of command. It eventually reached the desks of men like Luftwaffe State Secretary Erhard Milch, the pragmatic architect of German aircraft production. For leaders like him, the technical analysis only confirmed what they already believed. The report wasn't a warning. It was evidence of the enemy's desperation and arrogance. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, would later claim in his memoirs, an account that must be treated with extreme caution as it was written to absolve himself of responsibility, that reports of America's industrial might were a running joke within Hitler's inner circle. They would laugh at the absurd, boastful figures. For these men, accepting the Willow Run numbers was not just an intelligence assessment, it was a concession. It would mean admitting that Germany's vaunted system of master craftsmanship was obsolete. It would mean that the industrial war might already be lost. Dismissing the report as a bluff was the path of least resistance, a way to protect a worldview essential for morale. But what of the Abwehr itself? Why didn't its chief, Admiral Canaris, fight for his agency's findings? This is where the story pivots from a single report to the reality of institutional power. The Abwehr's primary function was to acquire and deliver intelligence. It was not its job to force the Luftwaffe or the High Command to believe it. Canaris was a political survivor, navigating a treacherous environment of rivals like the SS Intelligence Service, the SD. His own position was precarious. While post-war narratives have sometimes painted Canaris as a secret resistance figure, there is no contemporary evidence that he championed this specific report or risked his standing to defend its conclusions. He had delivered the data. Its interpretation, and the consequences of that interpretation, now belong to others. This was not the failure of one man to be brave. It was the failure of a rigid, hierarchical system where bad news was unwelcome and inconvenient facts were easily discarded. Yet not everyone in the Reich was blind. Deep within the Reich Economics Ministry, there were statisticians and analysts whose job was to track global resources. They didn't look at factory floor plans. They looked at raw economic potential, and they knew the truth. They knew that in 1942, the United States produced more steel, more oil, and far more aluminum than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. They understood that America's protected industrial base and vast resources gave it a theoretical capacity that dwarfed the Axis. But these were lower-level experts. Their warnings were buried in dense economic tables and cautious bureaucratic language. Their abstract data about potential output could not compete with the confident, dismissive judgments coming from the military high command. The consensus at the top was set, reinforced by technical analysis, ideological conviction, and political necessity. The Americans were bluffing. And so, the report on Willow Run, one of the most accurate and vital pieces of industrial intelligence of the war, was filed away. In Berlin, the German leadership felt secure in their judgment, and for a brief, critical period, events on the ground in Michigan seemed to prove them absolutely right. Because back in Michigan, the American production miracle was, in fact, a colossal failure. Henry Ford's grand experiment to apply automotive techniques directly to the immense complexity of an aircraft had stalled. The B-24 Liberator was not a simple car. It was a flying machine with over 30,000 precision parts, demanding a level of accuracy completely alien to automobile manufacturing. The factory's remote location created a logistical nightmare and a severe housing crisis, leading to astronomical labor turnover. The promised bomber an hour was a bitter joke on the factory floor. Through late 1942 and into the summer of 1943, the plant was lucky to finish one bomber a day. Here lies the most profound irony. Had German intelligence obtained a single, detailed follow-up report during this time, it would have confirmed their every suspicion. The American miracle was a dud. This temporary reality was perhaps the most damaging factor of all. It validated their disbelief and removed any urgency to reevaluate the threat. But while the German high command looked away, satisfied, the American engineers, logisticians, and workers at Willow Run were not giving up. They were solving every single problem, one by one. And then, in the cold, clear skies of February 1944, the result of that solved equation arrived over the Reich. During a single, concentrated series of raids codenamed Big Week, the world above Germany changed. For a Luftwaffe pilot scrambling to intercept, the sight was a physical shock. Not a disorganized swarm, but disciplined combat boxes of four-engine bombers stretching to the horizon, an endless, geometric river of aluminum and steel. Among them, flying in relentless waves, were thousands of B-24 Liberators. The abstract number from the 1942 intelligence report, one bomber an hour, was no longer a statistic filed away in a Berlin office. It was a physical, unstoppable reality. The propaganda they had dismissed was now systematically dismantling the German war industry, hitting the very aircraft factories at Regensburg and Gotha that had once been the benchmark for their disbelief. The intellectual debate was over, settled by brute force at 20,000 feet. For the men on the ground and in the air, the realization was absolute and helpless. The truth had arrived. The bomber an hour was never a lie. It was a production schedule, and Germany was fatally behind. So we returned to that desk in Berlin in 1942. The evidence of America's industrial power was delivered to the Third Reich's leadership twice, first as a piece of paper, and then as an armada in the sky. The rejection of that paper was not a simple miscalculation. It was a profound failure of imagination. German leaders were trapped by their own success and their own ideology. Their master craftsmen couldn't conceive of mass production on this scale, and their political doctrine couldn't accept that a nation they despised as decadent and disorganized could achieve it. The story of Willow Run is not about a single missed report that lost the war. It is a stark lesson that intelligence is useless without the context and humility to understand it. It proves that victory in modern warfare depends not only on what you can build, but on what you can dare to believe your enemy is capable of building. The full truth of America's industrial power would ultimately arrive in Berlin twice. It came first as an intelligence report, a piece of paper filled with numbers so unbelievable they were dismissed as propaganda. It came the second time as a sky filled with bombers, an armada so vast it could not be.